On the note of something special, I'd like to welcome today's speaker, Dave Lowe. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks very much. Very nice to be here.
Thank you for getting up a little early. It's not quite, well, it's just after 5 o'clock New Zealand time, so thanks for
Yeah.
doing that. Let me quickly introduce Dave. So Dave is a New Zealand atmospheric chemist and was the first person to show that atmospheric CO2 was increasing in the Southern Hemisphere almost 50 years ago. Alongside where he lives in New Zealand, he's worked in research labs in the United States and Germany, and was one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Nobel Peace Prize winning report in 2007. I don't believe we've ever featured a Nobel Peace Prize recipient before. So Dave, thanks for making history with us, and let me turn all the proceedings over to you. Welcome. Dave, you good to go? Do you want to start with your presentation?
Yep, here we go.
Perfect.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It is indeed 5 a.m. here on Friday morning. It's a long time since I've been up this early. What I'm going to do today is not so much talk about climate change as so my screen seems to be locked up here, Sandy. I'm not
Just
sure
press
what's
your space
going
bar.
on.
That should advance your slide.
Okay, let's do that.
And make sure you're clicked onto the presentation and not a Zoom. Yep.
Yep. Here we go. Okay, now we're working. So these are the topics that I'd like to go through. So I'll start off with just some basic concepts about how the planet works, what's going on, some of the observations. One thing I thought would be really interesting sharing with your group, discussing with your group, is the similarities between climate change and COVID-19. There's a lot of things to learn there. I'll finish off. I'd like to see whether you can figure out whether I'm a pessimist or an optimist. And then I'm going to leave a screen up with a bunch of questions on it. And these are very much questions from a Kiwi, someone who has lived and worked in the United States as well as Germany, as Sandy said. And it'll be very interesting to get your take on some of the queries that I put up. So we'll see if we can run that in an interactive way. So starting off, just a couple of concepts about the climate of the Earth. And the first one, I'm just simply going to call the thin film. And so this is a satellite picture of New Zealand. You can see New Zealand South Island here. If you look at the top of the screen, you can see this very thin blue line. Now that's the atmosphere. It's probably the top there before you can see space. It's probably around about 100 kilometers up in the atmosphere. Now, the thing about the atmosphere is that it is incredibly thin. The part that supports life is really only about 5 kilometers thick. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to use metric units. New Zealand has been metric for forever, as far as I know. 5 kilometers, probably about 3 miles. Once you get above that, the atmospheric pressure is down to about half of what it is on the surface. And the average temperature is minus 50 Celsius. There's quite a lot of ultraviolet radiation, and it's pretty much impossible for any life to survive above that. So we're very, very dependent on the properties of this thin film, both its physical and chemical properties, for all sorts of phenomena. And one of them is what I'll refer to as the natural greenhouse effect. So the next concept I'd like to get across is one of equilibria and Earth system science. And the fascinating thing to me is that if you go back in the history of indigenous peoples, and pretty well all of the indigenous peoples around the world have a feeling for what they might call the Earth Mother, or the Earth itself, and how how the Earth, how their environment actually looks after them. And that principle is actually embodied, the same principle in scientific terms, in a modern field of science known as Earth system science. And the idea there is that the Earth is actually split into 4 giant reservoirs, and I've got 3 of them shown here. One of them is the atmosphere. We have the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere, as well as that, the planet's rocks. Now, there have been natural cycles which have cycled things like water, nitrogen, and carbon for hundreds of millions of years. The whole thing has been in equilibrium. So what's going on now is that we are actually taking carbon out of that 4th reservoir, the rocks, where it's being stored for hundreds of millions of years, out of contact with the other 3 reservoirs, and we're introducing it into the active Earth system. And so that's changing the properties, dramatically changing the properties of the extra carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And that you can see, once that CO2, which is derived from burning fossil fuels, winds up in the Earth system, essentially half of it stays in the atmosphere forever in terms of human lifetime. The remainder, we know, goes down into the oceans and into the biosphere. So it wasn't until the 1950s, well, let's go back a bit to the late 19th century. A Swedish scientist, Svante Arrhenius, who's actually a distant relative of Greta Thunberg, if you've heard of her, the Swedish schoolgirl who started the school strikes movement, Fridays for Future. He came up with the idea that, hey, maybe increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could lead to warming of the Earth. But no one knew. And in the 1900s, the first part of last century, people weren't terribly interested in what was going on. There was the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, a whole succession of conflicts. And any engineering and science money, really, the priority was industrial and military. So it wasn't really until the 1950s that there started to be thoughts about what was going on with the atmosphere. And this person here is Dave Keeling, who is the founder of what's come to be known as the Keeling curve, which I'll be showing later on. He was doing a postdoc in California, and he needed to know what the background concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was for this project he had. And there were no data, or there were data and they were just all over the place. You really didn't have a feeling for what was going on in the atmosphere as a whole. So he set up some equipment on Mauna Loa, which is on the big island of Hawaii. It's a mountain, at this meteorological observatory, which is 3,000 meters above sea level. And his idea was that this was in the free atmosphere above the boundary layer, and he'd be able to figure out what was going on with atmospheric carbon dioxide. So he did that, and he found almost immediately, within the space of 2 to 3 years, that is, he found 2 remarkable things. And the first thing was that he discovered that there was a seasonal cycle in atmospheric carbon dioxide in the northern hemisphere. He found that it reached a maximum towards the end of spring, before your summer in the northern hemisphere, and then it went down, and then in your autumn, or the fall, you call it, it started to increase again. And what he discovered was essentially the planet breathing. This was completely natural. It was the biosphere, all of the plants in the northern hemisphere responding to the seasons. And this is a true seasonal cycle, showing how the biosphere in the northern hemisphere pulls out carbon dioxide during the spring and then releases it during the fall. But the second thing he found was anything but natural, and that was that there was this increase, this insidious increase, and that using isotopic measurements, he was able to show, it was a direct fingerprint, smoking gun evidence, that it actually was excess CO2 derived from fossil fuels. So this was a remarkable discovery. Now, the thing is, this was the Northern Hemisphere, and he could tell on the basis of records from oil companies, coal companies, that only about half of the carbon dioxide was remaining in the atmosphere. What was happening to the rest of it? This was critical. And he surmised that it was probably going into the oceans in the Southern Hemisphere. So in the 1960s, he visited New Zealand with the view, we're in the mid-latitudes of the Southern Hemisphere. Where I am is 41 degrees south. And he figured that it was a great place to set up atmospheric carbon dioxide measurements because New Zealand is just a couple of islands in the middle of the ocean. And so he sent a team, a scientist and 2 technicians in the late 60s to New Zealand and started work on putting up equipment. And he needed a New Zealander, and guess who that was? So serendipity is a funny thing. There I was 50 years ago, a Kiwi kid, bit of a change to the hair colour. And it was me that really set up these first measurements in the Southern Hemisphere. And here they are. And the black one there is the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see that seasonal oscillation going on. And you can see this extraordinary growth in that time, in my working lifetime. It's around about 30% increase. And I've just watched this in horror ever since I first started. The red line is the New Zealand site. We call it Bering Head. And you can see the seasonal cycle isn't there. And that's because the Southern Ocean is very much the ocean hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere. So you don't have the same plant uptake that you do in the Northern Hemisphere. So just moving briefly now, we all know that global temperatures have increased. About the time I was making measurements, there really was that was about here in 1970, the temperature wasn't going up. If anything, it had gone down. And so this was an odd thing. You could see the physics, the radiative forcing calculations. There should have been a signal, but there wasn't. And it wasn't for about another 10 years that really the signal started in earnest. And now, as you can see, I've written here, this century, in the last 20 years, 12 of the hottest years ever recorded have been observed. And we are just really moving into dangerous climate change territory at an extreme rate. If you look at what's going on, other climate risks, of course, hurricanes, we call them cyclones here in the Southern Hemisphere. It used to be that the most damaging natural events were earthquakes. And for example, the Fukushima disaster in Japan, that was around about, with the following tsunami, that was around about 300 billion US dollars. Well, there were a couple of hurricanes in the US 3 years ago, Harvey and Irma, and they were about the same order, about $300 billion each. So this is enormous damage and a huge hit on your economy. In New Zealand, we get hit by the tail end of tropical cyclones, and these cause enormous damage down here. Typically, there's less than one a year. In 2018, we had 4, and the damage was extraordinary. Climate change is starting to have a huge effect on the world economy, and that will increase dramatically as the effects increase. Another thing to share with your group is actually refugees. And the situation in Syria, of course, is just absolutely terrible, a war that's gone on now for 9 years. But the start of that really was driven by a drought, a terrible drought, which pushed all the rural communities into the cities. And then there were issues with Assad. And as you know, just a huge conflict, which has gone on and has huge international repercussions. So moving on to the Paris Climate Agreement, this was 5 years ago. And what happened there was that virtually all countries in the world ratified this in the form of pledges, non-binding pledges, as to how much they were going to start reducing their carbon emissions. And the idea was to try and hold the increase in the global temperature below 2 degrees. And at the moment, we're around about 1 or maybe even 1.1 degrees. This is above pre-industrial levels, which are defined as 1750, so about 250 years ago. So hold it to below 2. And the idea was, if possible, try and hold it below 1.5 degrees, or limit it to 1.5 degrees. The reason for that, a lot of that has to do with coral reefs. The thing about coral reefs is they're very, very sensitive to both increases in seawater temperature as well as increasing acidity. And what happens when carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it makes it more acid. And so you've probably heard that now, already in 2020, about half the coral reefs on Earth have gone. And it's expected that within the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years or so, virtually all of the rest will be gone. And this has to do with 1.5 degrees. It's projected that if we can hold the temperature to 1.5 degrees, then we'll save the reefs. The idea behind that is that there are literally 1 billion people on Earth who are in one way or another dependent on those reefs, because they really they support the whole marine ecosystem in terms of fisheries. So that's a vital thing to try and do. So for me, what's happened since the Paris Accord? It's now 5 years ago. Well, for someone like me who looks at the concentration of trace gases like carbon dioxide, CO2 and methane, nothing at all. It's really horrifying just to see how these gases have just continued to increase. In fact, essentially at an exponential rate. There has never really been a realistic price put on the damage to the atmosphere by carbon emissions. So you drive a diesel or petrol, I guess you call it a gasoline powered car, you're not paying for what you're doing to the atmosphere. In the case of water pollution, certainly in this country, if you pollute a waterway, you're in big trouble. You have to pay a serious fine, and in really bad cases, you might well go to jail. The thing is that if we keep on with this carbon lifestyle, dangerous climate change is inevitable. And you've already seen, essentially, the implications for life on Earth are just catastrophic. So this is an existential threat to humans. This is something we need to tackle. How do we stop the warming? Well, we now know that we're emitting around about 40 billion tonnes of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide every year. Not long ago, we'd emitted around 2/3 of the total budget. We're now up around a bit over 70%. And unfortunately, we're now pretty sure that if we keep on at this rate, that 1.5 degree budget is gone next year. So the temperature next year might be 1.1 or 1.2, but there's already a lot of heat that's been absorbed in the oceans that will come out. So even if we shut down carbon emissions now, the temperature would still creep up to 1.5 degrees. So this is a really serious situation. Now, that's the science. Moving on to some of the things that are happening. Actually, I'm very optimistic when I look at engineering and science, and I look at the ingenuity of human beings. Very interesting situation in the USA, and in fact in the OECD countries altogether. Now you can see that renewables, which is this green line here for electricity production, are actually exceeding coal. And this is the same situation in the US. Renewables now are around about 20%. This is now actually an average for the OECD here. And the situation with carbon dioxide from coal, worldwide, the principal source of carbon dioxide, of actually all of the greenhouse gases, has been coal-fired power plants. And in the USA, there's been a huge change over to fracking, getting natural gas or methane out of old oil wells. And so a lot of your coal-fired power plants have been converted over to using gas. And if you were going to burn a fossil fuel, you're a lot better off burning gas than you are coal. In terms of CO2 emissions per unit of energy that you get out, you're way, way ahead. So overall in the USA, surprisingly, I will use the word surprisingly, emissions have been going down slightly over the last few years, which is a very good thing. Whether that will continue, of course, is unknown. It depends on a lot on the politics and the drive towards renewable energy in the US. So I talked about the role of engineers. It's extraordinary what's out there. I've talked about the role of terrestrial vegetation. Well, vegetation is actually very, very inefficient in terms of converting energy from the sun into sugars, which form the basis of life on Earth. It's now known that you can actually engineer artificial leaves and increase the efficiency of photosynthesis. The hydrogen economy, to me, this is very exciting. With renewable electricity, it's possible to use electrolysis to make hydrogen. Once you've got the hydrogen, you can start to use that directly in vehicles. You can use it as a fuel, you can burn it, or you can combine it with carbon dioxide and you can start to make other carbon-based fuels like jet fuel. So for quite a while, it's been thought that aviation might be an intractable problem. You can't really run all the aircraft in the world on biofuels, but now there's quite a possibility that the hydrogen economy itself could help with that. So one of the big issues, one of the things that I've been looking at is young people. You figure that in a way what's gone on is a kind of an intergenerational crime. Young people are really very, very badly affected. And so is the older generation to blame for this? And so I've talked to a lot of young people. They're highly motivated. They really, really want to get out there and make sure that the politicians are understanding the science and doing something about it. And certainly their teachers, their lecturers are very, very important here. As I mentioned, the role of engineers and scientists, that's absolutely essential. So the last major topic I'd like to talk about, actually I should have said, boy, I'm told I have a very strong New Zealand accent. I hope you guys are understanding this okay. So COVID-19, who would have thought? I was just talking to Sandy before we started. 2020, what an extraordinary year. This time in 2019, I think none of us could have predicted that we'd be in this situation. The thing is that COVID-19 or pandemic, dreadful virus, it's an existential threat to humans. We face a number of them. That's one of them. To me, a failure of democracy is possibly another one. Also, climate change is a very, very serious threat to the human race. But here's the intriguing thing. It's now known that in 2020, because of the extensive lockdowns and the reduction in both industrial and agricultural activity, that the greenhouse gas emissions, that's the GHG emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, they're going to fall by more than any other year on record. And it's projected around about 7% compared to this time last year. So that takes us back effectively to 2010 levels. So it's been very hard, but that's very good news. But here's the thing, if we really want to meet those Paris Accord temperature targets, we're going to have to halve the emissions that we have at the moment and then reach net zero carbon by 2050. So that's a very, very hard target. And it means that the 2020s really are a critical decade. We really have to make progress every year through this decade to have any chance of doing this. If you look at the role of governments, if there's no government intervention, and particularly the economic recovery packages, the stimulus packages that are going to be coming out, if they're not used prudently, these emissions are going to rebound as soon as the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted. So what are the similarities between COVID-19 and climate change? Well, to me, really both of them involve complex science. You have to be resilient to survive it. Political leadership is imperative, and that political leadership, of course, has to be on the basis of really good scientific and economic advice acted on. And above all, you've got to have public support. So if you look around the world, the countries that have done the best have all had trusted leadership, and they've all acted immediately on the best available medical and scientific advice. And there's been widespread public support for doing that. So just as an aside, I thought you might be interested in New Zealand. The first COVID-19 cases here came through in March, and under advice, the New Zealand government shut down the New Zealand economy and quite a severe lockdown for 6 weeks. We had 22 deaths, community transmission in what were known as clusters, about 4 or 5 of them with 80 people each. The 6-week shutdown eradicated COVID-19, so we were completely clear of it. Then it came back again, another minor outbreak around about 2 months ago, much smaller, and that was eradicated. So the country has no community transmission of COVID-19. What we do have is the borders are open to returning New Zealanders and essential workers. And when people return, they have to go into what's called managed isolation. These are hotels near the airports, and they're tested for COVID-19. And every day, aircraft come in. There's around about half a dozen people who test positive for COVID-19. They stay in quarantine for 2 weeks, and then they're released into New Zealand, which is COVID-19 free. So they've relied on contact tracing, and you can see this QR code here. My wife and I and son run a small science company. All companies are required to display these on the doors entering their premises. And you scan them, and around about 3 million New Zealanders, 3 out of 5 million, have signed up for this. You just scan it with your smartphone. The data stays on your smartphone. If there is an outbreak, then you're contacted, and it really helps with the contact tracing, which is key to wiping out any community transmission of COVID-19. So you can see this is an example of public support run by leadership, and it's been extremely helpful here in New Zealand. So I'm just going to finish off now. About this time last year, there was a story printed in virtually every newspaper in New Zealand and Australia about my life, how I've been following the increase of carbon dioxide. I started those measurements, as you saw, 50 years ago. And what I've done, essentially, it's all about public outreach. I'm trying to talk to as many people as possible, scientific leaders. Everyone knows this, but it's really important to try and reach the average public. And so I guess mostly under lockdown, that was a great opportunity. I've written a book, which is a sort of a popular book. It follows this journey, my journey through New Zealand, the United States and Germany, a mixture of despair and hope. It's a kind of it's known as a hero's journey, this approach. And the idea is to have the reader follow this poor guy on his journey through and get hope on the techniques, because I am hopeful, I am optimistic on what we can do to reduce carbon emissions. And at the same time, there's a documentary filmmaker here. This guy, he's called Costa Botes. He worked with Peter Jackson on the Lord of the Rings series, so he's a very good filmmaker. He's making a documentary film that follows the same journey. So this is the last slide. Essentially, where I started the thin film, you'll have seen from what I presented, increasing carbon emissions, it really is not a valid option if we want to continue life on this atmosphere without invoking a catastrophe. And so what I'd like to do now, and I guess you're around, Sandy, I've put up a bunch of questions here, and I thought it would be really great for a New Zealander to talk to some Americans about some of these issues. The issues have to do with what we think about climate change, but they also go a bit further than that. They go into politics. And the very first one I put up here, Sandy, you can see, it has to do with the rights of the individual versus the needs and responsibility to the many. And when I look at the differences between a country like New Zealand and a country like the United States, I think this would be a very interesting question to follow because it looks like there's a huge philosophical difference. I talked to you about how when people come into the country at the moment, they have to go into managed isolation. Apparently, yesterday there was a news report in the US, and it was widely reported here in New Zealand, that, New Zealand is running these concentration camps at the border for people returning, and that their freedom is being denied to them. So this is, I'd be very interested to hear what is going on here. How do you think that trying to eradicate COVID-19 so that you're improving the well-being and the economy for most people is a removal of the basic rights of a person? So perhaps if there's anyone out there, I'd be very interested to hear what your what your response is. Because the right to emit carbon as well as the right to not wear a mask, to me, those things are equivalent.
Do you want to go through all the questions, Dave, or do you want us to pause on that first question?
Yeah, I guess let's see how we go on that one, and then we can come on to those other ones.
All right, so folks, if you'd like to comment on that first question, just type into the Q&A. I can also unmute you if you'd like to leave a comment or to say a comment. But let me know in the Q&A panel your thoughts. Dave, while that's happening, why don't I just quickly ask you a question, if that's all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, the Trump administration obviously made big headlines here and around the world by deciding to pull out of the Paris Accord. From where you sit, what are the implications of that? And do you have a different perspective on this withdrawal than we might have here in the United States?
Yeah, okay. I mean, obviously that was huge news here. My understanding is the United States is one of 3 countries who are currently not signed up to the Paris Accord. The other 2, I think one of them is Venezuela. I'm not sure who the other one is.
Maybe North Korea.
North Korea could be. Yeah, no, the thing is that I think there are huge international repercussions for that. You worry about a domino effect because, of course, the United States, in terms of current carbon emissions, is second after China. And so you might get countries like India, for example, some of the other developing nations who might think, oh, look, the United States is not pulling its weight. Why should we bother about this? So there are those international implications. The thing about the Paris Accord is it's entirely voluntary. What was put forward were pledges. So under the Obama administration, the United States pledged to cut its emissions by a certain amount, by a certain date, and as did all other countries. I think what's going to happen is increasingly, as the effects of climate change become clear, there really are going to be trade sanctions going on. So the European Union, for example, is dropping its emissions, not quite enough, but pretty well. They're going to be increasingly unhappy about trading with countries who have high carbon emissions.
Well, there's just one comment on the question that you asked, but let's just keep going on the Paris Accord just for a second. This is a question from Linda Barker, and she asks, are the Paris Accord targets still considered to be sufficient or accurate as a starting goal? Wondering how those were in fact determined, and if science has determined that these goals need to be adjusted for the future.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the Paris Accord pledges, or the goals, are now seen as not accurate, and one of the reasons for that is, unfortunately, there's been a dramatic increase in methane, along with CO2. Methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, and so that's viewed with a lot of concern, and so there are having to be some adjustments made.
Okay. So we have a couple comments about your first question, and I should preface this by saying, New Mexico has been, I would say, a leader among states in terms of our response, and really to addressing that question of the balance between individual rights and society rights or collective rights. And we certainly have examples in Texas to the south and Arizona to the west, whereby the feelings of individual rights, i.e., I can do what I want because these are my rights, is very different. So a couple of folks say, spending 6 weeks in quarantine to rid ourselves of COVID-19 is not too much to ask. Many of us have been home, except for grocery pickup and others, for a long time now, especially those of us raising children. And there seems to be sentiment to agree with the fact that, you know, we are in this together, and what it takes to rid ourselves of COVID-19 is what we are prepared to do.
Yeah, that's really really great to hear. That's heartwarming, because of course the news in New Zealand about the United States, it tends to treat the United States as one country, and I mean it's like you have 50 separate countries, and certainly in New Mexico you have a very different viewpoint on the international situation, as well as dealing with a lot of environmental situations. So what we see in New Zealand in terms of the news is pretty grim. You know, quite a lot is being made of the fact that you're going into winter.
Yep.
We have the opposite seasons here in New Zealand. We've just come through a winter, so we've battled this thing, COVID-19, right through our winter, and we've come through to the other side pretty well. And now we have a summer where you're going outside and social distancing is easy. You're not cooped up inside. So a lot is being made of the United States, where people are going to have to be jammed indoors during a dreadful winter. So,
It's true.
yeah.
And one of the big challenges is it doesn't really matter how effective New Mexico's strategy is. I mean, it does, but we're connected to other states all around us. And in the absence of federal leadership mandating what specific policies should be, from masks to treatment protocols and so on, we in New Mexico are ultimately at the mercy of what the states around us, and being a tourist state too, I mean, much like New Zealand, it's a very difficult thing to control, because suddenly we're tapping into big economic streams in the state. And so we are, you know, we feel, I think in many ways, the absence of federal leadership on this as strongly as any other state that's really doing the best it can to address this issue.
Yeah, yeah.
So, well, here's a quick comment from Chuck Boxwell, sorry, Chuck, that addresses this, and he says, there are a number of very conservative individuals in the United States that see their desires as more important than the needs of the community. I couldn't agree more. I believe that most Americans would respond favorably to the needs of the larger community if the issue was properly presented by the US leadership. Again, I agree completely. I see your point about the comparison between wearing masks and carbon in the atmosphere. I believe if approached this way, there would be much greater support in the US and around the world. We need to be more focused on the greater good than just our own desires and needs.
Okay. All right. Well, it certainly goes without saying. That's my belief. The only way we're going to get through these existential threats is by working together, by a concerted approach, and particularly with good political leadership that is driven by science, economics, medical people, if it's in the case of a pandemic. We have to rely on expert scientific advice. And the news in New Zealand about the US is that there's no credence taken to scientific advice in the control of this pandemic.
It is a peculiar aspect of this country that a lot of people distrust the opinions of experts. And I certainly hope this is a blip in time, and that whoever is elected to office at any level, from the local, state to the national, surrounds themselves with smart people. This country is bursting with smart people.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet we need them in the right positions to be able to express their science, express their well-reasoned thoughts and opinions, and help translate those into policy.
Yep.
You had a big election a couple of weeks ago. A landslide was given to your inspiring prime minister. Does that change in any way what's happening with coronavirus or even climate change efforts?
No, not at all. So the political system that we have here is called mixed member proportional, MMP for short. And it's actually an exact copy of the system in Germany and several other countries. And so what happens is, at an election time, you vote for a particular person as well as a party. And when all the votes are tallied, you wind up with a coalition government which was voted for by most of the people. And so you can imagine for a New Zealander looking at the United States, where you have a situation where you can have a president who didn't receive the majority of the votes. In other words, most people didn't vote for him. That it seems to us almost archaic, an archaic political system that in 2020 or in the 21st century could produce a result like that. But in saying that, the recent election here was unprecedented, and that Jacinda Ardern's party actually received a working majority. They don't have to work with any other party, and that's never ever happened before. They were just so popular. A lot of it was a mandate for what she did for what the party did for COVID-19. But they have decided to work anyway with one of the other minor parties, the Green Party, and they will form a coalition, even though they don't need to, with the Green Party, because the Green Party, by its very name, they have experience with climate change.
We had a little comparative politics session with my 10 and 12-year-old the other night, and I explained Canadian parliamentary system. It took about 5 minutes to explain, and then when we started to talk about, the U.S. democracy and the Electoral College is the obvious example, or what happened in the year 2000 with the election. It's a much more complicated picture, and I would use the word update. It needs to be updated.
Okay.
And let us hope we can get some sort of leadership to respond to that. I have, Dave, another comment here from the audience, and maybe after this we can move to your second question. This is from Catherine Jean Jerrison. I apologize if I got your name wrong. Freedom is just the latest point raised in opposition to a rational scientific response to crises. Totally agree. Both COVID and climate change have traditionally been fought over as an economic issue, that is, jobs versus the environment. In one sense, the reduction in carbon due to the economic contraction caused by COVID reinforces the argument that massive economic contraction would be needed to fight climate change. Fear of change is a highly effective political driver. We need to move the emphasis on how a cleaner environment can have a positive effect on economies. I think that's all pretty spot on.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with that. And there are Nobel Prize winning economists who have looked at the situation of running an economy which isn't driven by growth. Because when you think about it, an economy that's driven by growth, that's illogical if you've got a finite planet, finite resources. It's never going to work. And so what many economists are now showing is that it's completely possible to have an economy which is not based on growth and delivers very, very good lifestyles to all people. And they've shown that if we don't do anything about carbon emissions, and in fact we start having more and more hurricanes, wildfires. I understand the US is suffering from wildfires at the moment. If we don't do anything about it, then the hit on the economy, the economic damage, and I showed you some figures, is going to be colossal compared to the relatively small shrinkage in the economy caused by putting a price on carbon. So we are talking about my second question there now. Putting a price on carbon, which reflects the damage that's being done to the atmosphere, is absolutely essential. The other point that I'd make is that if you look at the so-called green economy, it's not a green economy, it's in a using the planet in a sustainable way. Those jobs in the US completely outnumber now the jobs in the fossil fuel industry. And they're great jobs. I mean, they're very fascinating. Working on electric cars, in the electric power industry, on photovoltaics, all of these, you're looking at high-tech, fascinating, well-paid jobs compared to working on, an open cast coal mine. So economically, going back to that question, I think there is no question that we're going to be ahead if we start moving towards a high-tech, low-carbon economy.
And this was another thing we were trying to explain to our children the other night, that government itself plays or can play a significant role in that very dynamic by, for example, subsidizing the production and or purchase of solar panels, for example. How has the New Zealand government responded to some of these particular issues? Does it play an active role in trying to stimulate certain parts of the sort of green economy, or what's your perspective on that?
It has been a bit of a mixed bag. They certainly, at the moment, there's a lot of stimulus going into what's called the hydrogen economy. Because most of New Zealand's electricity is renewable, it's a no-brainer to have electric cars, for example, or to actually convert the energy and electricity into hydrogen, which can then be used to drive fuel cells. As I pointed out, it can be turned into carbon-based fuels as well, renewably. You can combine hydrogen with CO2 from the atmosphere to make carbon fuels. You're ahead because that's renewable. So there's been a lot of stimulus into that. There has not so far been a fee-based scheme for low emissions vehicles, but it's expected that will come through within a year or so. And this has been very, very successful in Scandinavian countries. If you look at Norway, for example, now, most of the newer vehicles that are sold are electric vehicles. So that makes a huge difference to emissions. In New Zealand, the fastest growing source of carbon emissions is actually the light vehicle fleet. So tackling these electric vehicles, making sure that we have low emissions vehicles is a low hanging fruit, the economists would call it, in this country. I've lost your sound.
That was me. I muted it because I had a bunch of kids making too much noise behind me. What if you were, let's say, if you were president of the world, Dave? If such a position existed, what would be a couple, low-hanging fruit or really obvious things that you would do to help people make the right decisions as consumers or as societies in moving forward in a more sustainable way?
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you're president of the world, you're not only facing climate change, of course, you've got multiple existential threats and issues to worry about. So if we just looked at the climate change one, absolutely essential to start with reducing carbon. And so it depends where you are in the world. The most efficient way to reduce carbon in New Zealand mightn't be the same as in the US. But you would use your government to provide incentives to companies that can actually reduce carbon in a meaningful way. So you would do that right away. I think, looking at air travel. Air travel has been quite an issue in terms of increasing carbon. So you'd really have to look at technological ways of reducing emissions from air travel. That's a really big one. Agriculture, if the Earth's population is projected goes up to 10 billion, Sandy, 10 billion people can't all eat beef. That's just not going to work. So you'd have to have a serious look at other ways of making protein than having cattle. Well, you have industrial farming in the US. We have pastures here, but you'd have to have a look seriously at how else you can produce protein in a sustainable way.
Without a doubt. Well, you just touched on a question that David Geyer asked here, and David says, net population increase of the Earth is around 300,000 people a day. I did not know that. How do we connect, population control with climate change, with, awareness of some of these issues? And, is population control something that you think about or have ideas on?
Well, the interesting thing about that, I mean, we've grown up with the thought that population is going to be a serious issue, and it is a serious issue, but the growth rate has slowed right down. And when you look at the United Nations, WHO and other organisations within the United Nations, UNESCO, they're showing now that in actual fact, the Earth's population is going to level off at 10 billion or below. So there's a lot of reasons for that. More and more people have been educated. A lot of kids now in the developing countries, there's electricity, they can do homework, they're educated, which means that they're not going on to have, the women, the girls are not going on to have huge families. And that's very, very noticeable. So oddly enough, that problem, I'm not saying it's going away, but it's not as serious as has been thought.
Yeah, we certainly have some big challenges in front of us, but I always like to remind myself that we humans have been struggling about our growth since Thomas Malthus 300 years ago, and we've sort of always found a way to match our resources with our population, and yet in the face of these existential and very real threats happening now, it certainly feels like things have shifted a little bit, and that we've got some pretty serious issues in influencing and outright impacting our ability to respond to population growth.
Yeah, no.
Do you want to move into your last question around nationalism and internationalism?
Yeah, so I figured that's a pretty good one for your group. And once again, it's a Kiwi perspective. If you're on a little, you live in a little country like ours, which is a couple of islands in the middle of a giant ocean, you're a trading nation. It really is all about internationalism. So we're obviously an active member of the United Nations, and we work with other countries for solutions. When you look at the issues with various democracies, both in Europe and the United States, there is this trend towards nationalism. And I see that as being very, very dangerous for threats like climate change as well as pandemics, because internationalism, in other words, countries cooperating, in the case of a pandemic, through an organization like the World Health Organization, that's absolutely essential. So that's my question. Here we are in New Zealand. I mean, we are absolutely driven by international connections and international relationships. You wouldn't ever think of a small country like ours saying, right, that's it, we don't need anyone else. we're going to turn the lights off everywhere else. It just seems inconceivable to me that countries in Europe, and you are starting to see a bit of that in Poland, for example, certainly in Hungary and Turkey, why that should be the case in the 21st century, I find extremely worrying. And I'd be very interested in any comments that your group might have.
Yeah, so folks chime in in the Q&A window. I think it is another fascinating, pendulum swing that has happened in this country for hundreds of years, with, the determination to look within, to close off thoughts and so on of foreign entanglements. And yet, we live in this bizarre time of high globalization that really can't be turned off or switched off. And so there's that underbelly of economics that kind of informs our internationalism. And then we have a lot of words from the Trump administration about wanting to withdraw from various organizations. Thankfully, those safeguards have been in place, especially around Paris, that it would take, a period of time for actual exit to happen. And then what's happening with WHO is concerning, to say the least, especially in this time of pandemic. But But yes, folks, please chime in on your thoughts on U.S. nationalism versus internationalism. It may well touch upon some of those fear issues that were raised in the Q&A before, where that lizard brain tends to spring towards my elbows are out and we want nothing to do with you in NATO, because this is not the time for that. And yet, I think we all know we live in a very delicate global architecture right now. Let me just read this question and comment from Shelley Winship, who's our Director of Development, and it's a good one. And she says, I'm curious about the trend toward megacities that complex system scientists such as Jeffrey West have been exploring, and these cities' potential for economies of scale and concentrated innovation that might actually help with climate change, versus what we're experiencing this year, with a shift to working from home, and of course in the United States, a post-COVID surge in home purchases in more rural areas. If, in fact, we are moving to remote work, would the needed infrastructure and built environment be even more damaging in terms of accelerating climate change? Or is the reduction in vehicle use enough to tip the scales? A lot of threads there, but maybe get some quick thoughts from you on that.
Yeah, no, when you were reading out that question, the first thing I thought about was, well, hey, working from home, which is certainly what's happened here in New Zealand, resulted in a huge drop in traffic. And then the end of the question or the comment, came to that same conclusion. I think there's no doubt about it. The mega cities, building a sustainable city where you've got lots of public transport, shared resources, is a very, very effective way of reducing carbon emissions. Here in New Zealand, a lot of people tend to have lifestyle blocks, and there's been some calculations shown you have maybe 4,000 square meters. I don't know what that is in acres. I'm sorry.
I should know that.
Some acres of land, and they, big deal, and they're running a few sheep and cows and so on. It's actually pretty bad for the environment. There's a lot of diesel and petrol goes into supporting that. That same person living in a city and sharing a communal garden, and a lot of cities in New Zealand and certainly in Europe, they have allotments where you can actually grow a lot of stuff. That's a far more effective way of reducing carbon emissions per capita than having someone running a few sheep and cows way out in the country. So I'm rambling on a bit here. I thought that was a great question, but I think we have to look at sustainable cities. And if you look at the situation of my wife and I, we lived out in the country a few years ago, and we had 2 petrol cars. We now live in an urban environment on a very small property. It's around 400 square meters and a 110 square meter house. We've got a really good vegetable garden. We just have 1 car now. It's electric, and we use public transport. And so we've been able to use a carbon calculator. Our emissions per year have dropped from 20 tons of carbon dioxide for each of us down to 7 by doing that. And so that bears up what the person said about living in a city. You can actually dramatically reduce your carbon dioxide emissions by being part of a sustainable city. Very interesting, in Denmark, Copenhagen is well on the way to being net carbon zero. I don't know whether you knew that, just by techniques like this. They expect to be net carbon zero by 2025. So that this can be done. Santa Fe can do this, Sandy.
Well, and our big state utility has plans to get us to being carbon zero, not by 2025, but sooner than later as well. But I think your comments just reminded me really of your first question around the interplay between the individual and society, and perhaps in terms of climate change right now, given the lack of our leadership, of our society's leadership on it, it falls more to us on an individual level to really understand the carbon footprints that we create and how to, how to lessen that. And obviously, if everyone around the world can get down to a 7-ton per year output of carbon, we would be, I'm assuming, in a much better shape. I mean, tell me about that. If all of us individually, even just in the United States, took your message to heart, do we have a sense of what kind of impact that would have?
That would be huge.
Yeah.
The average emissions of people in North America are pretty high. I think they're up around 25 to 30. So if you reduce to 7, that would be huge. So if you look at the emissions at the moment, they're around 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year for the whole planet. We've got about a population of about 8 billion. So the average per person on the earth at the moment is about 5 tons per person. So even at 7, my wife and I, we're still above the average. And reducing even further is going to be hard, but we can see a way to do that.
A couple comments have come in around your question around nationalism versus internationalism. First, from Herb Thomas, he says, one extremely important country trending towards nationalism and a very destructive nationalism is India. In your opinion, do you think India's management of climate change is going in the right direction or not? Or how does that connect with their nationalist, drive?
Yeah, no, it's been, India's very, very complicated and quite a changing situation. By the way, I'm not an expert on international affairs. I'm just a simple physicist. But my understanding there is that they have put a lot of money and resources into renewable energy. So for a while there, they were the world's greatest coal consumer. Now they're seeing their way to actually removing their dependence on coal, that's a big issue. When you look at vehicles per person, I mean, that's a huge population. They don't have the transport issues, the light vehicle fleet that you do in the United States, or we have here in New Zealand. We have very high vehicle ownership here. They don't have that in India. So in terms of global citizens, and if you work it out per capita, they're actually pretty good.
Very good. I have another comment here from Lynn Heffron talking about Hungary. And she says a non-governmental organization in Hungary that promotes equal opportunity and pay for women has now joined hands with 3 other countries to continue these initiatives. This is one example of promoting internationalism as a way to kind of fend off their own country's nationalism, with Hungary being, of course, another great example of a veer to the nationalistic. That was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
And another comment, kind of echoes a lot of that what we said, which is, even within the United States, we're seeing a microcosm of the nationalism question: state versus state, the coast versus the center, red states versus blue states. And I think she's totally right in saying, nationalism has been conflated with patriotism
Yes.
in some key ways, and that's just a huge issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me shift gears a little bit, Dave. Let's talk about something pretty much none of us will experience, which is receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. What was that like? What, you got a phone call saying? Tell us about that moment in time.
Okay. No. Well, it would be one of the strangest things that I've ever experienced. So the United Nations, through UNESCO, produces international, they're called intergovernmental climate change reports, and they do this about once every 6 to 7 years. And so I was asked to be a lead author for a report which was published in 2007. There were around about 300 lead authors, 2 of us from New Zealand. It was 3 years of grueling work. It was one of the most intensive peer-reviewed publications I've ever worked on. It was absolutely grueling, but we came out with a report which showed the status of the climate at that change, the physics, the physical basis of it. And so we finished the report, it was all done and dusted, and then we received emails saying, well, actually, the Nobel Committee has decided to award the report the Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah, so I've got the certificate up on the wall there, saying, yeah, David C. Lowe contributing to the Nobel Peace Prize. So the point is here, Sandy, I am not a Nobel laureate. I'm about 1/300th of a Nobel laureate. So what do you think? Maybe this little finger here is a Nobel laureate. So that's what happened. So yeah, no, it was a huge honor.
Did you go to Stockholm to receive?
No, what they did was it was actually done on the throw of a dice. They decided randomly who would go out of the group, and there were about half a dozen people chosen through the random throw of a dice who was going to go. There was quite a lot of money associated with the prize, and we gave that towards a solar farm in a country in Africa.
Wow, wow, fascinating. Did anything change in terms of greater acceptance of climate change science, or what was the impact of winning the Nobel in your field?
Yeah, no, I think by that stage the reports were becoming pretty well accepted. So it didn't have any effect in that way, but it certainly had an effect on those of us who were lead authors for that report. What I did, I just turned 60, and I knew that I wanted to get more and more into climate change outreach. And so at that stage, I was working for a government science organisation in New Zealand, and I resigned outright to form the small company that I talked about. So I've been self-employed for the last 13 years now, working on climate outreach, and it's just been a great decision. I've done a lot of really interesting things in that time.
Well, I want to get to your final question that I see on the screen, but first a quick comment from Bill Dubuis, which I think really summarizes a lot of what we talked about. And he says, there are two great challenges for the United States right now. The first is restoring faith and confidence in expert and scientific knowledge, and also restoring commitment to the traditional social contract, which of course emphasizes the link between rights and responsibilities. We see this again and again here in terms of gun rights, mask wearing, carbon emission, so many other issues. So how do we reconnect responsibility to others alongside the preservation of our personal rights? This is the crux of the situation in the United States, and there's not really much of a solution in sight. I wonder if you have any final comments you want to offer on that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty tricky one for a New Zealander. I should ask your people, I mean, whether they have any questions to a New Zealander. But looking at that, yeah, gosh, I mean, for a New Zealander looking at the United States, it's an extraordinary country. All of the computer technology, the medical advances, you look at places like MIT, Harvard, the greatest universities on the planet. When you think of the good that the United States has done, which has percolated out into the rest of the world, the impact on societies outside the United States is huge, and you really admire it for that. So those other things that were just talked about there, gun control, pulling out of the Paris Accord, all of these things, they seem to be aberrations, hopefully temporary aberrations. It almost doesn't fit with all the good that has come out of the United States. So yeah, I mean, those are just gut feelings I have as a New Zealander looking towards the US from a small country perspective.
So Are you a pessimist, Dave, or are you an optimist?
Okay, so I'm actually both. Um, I'm very optimistic when I see the ingenuity of human beings and what engineers, scientists, and economists can do. I'm very pessimistic when I see what happens with political systems. I've talked to New Zealand Parliament, I've talked to politicians here till I'm blue in the face. And I describe it's like walking through treacle. And I think part of it might be us, it might be the constituents, because a politician has a very short term. In New Zealand, it's only 3 years. In the US, in terms of your presidential election, it's 4 years. That's actually a very short time to do something about problems which have a very long lifetime, and these might be health, education, as well as climate change. And so a politician who wants to be re-elected gets very, very nervous about tackling one of those issues, which is obviously going to have a big price tag. And so they tend to steer away from it. So does that bring the responsibility back to us as constituents worried about that word tax? A carbon tax, for example, or putting up taxes so you can teach children properly, have proper schools. These are, they're very, very big questions. So that's where I'm pessimistic with that political system. I just see difficulties in changing that quickly. Here in New Zealand, we're very optimistic when we see the extraordinary landslide win of Jacinda Ardern, and the fact that she refers to climate change as our nuclear moment. It's our time to really, really work on reducing carbon emissions. So I guess in a way, that's the good news.
Well, Dave, thank you so much. Wow, we just learned an awful lot. Thank you for the questions and the discussion as well. Obviously, this is a extremely complicated, interrelated set of issues for which there is no one direct solution. But I think a lot of your points and experience in science just help us understand yet again the complexity of this and how much action is required to take us forward. So thanks, Dave. Come on out to Santa Fe whenever travel resumes.
Okay, no, it's very, very nice to be here, and I wish you all the best for your election coming up, I guess in just a few days now. And it's just wonderful to see that you're running a group which has so much interest in international affairs and obviously interested in maintaining international linkages. Just so important in a very complicated world. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Dave. You take care, and thanks for joining us once again.
Okay, nice to be here.
Okay,
bye.
Bye.